Good evening. My name is Simon O'Connor. I'm the director of MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, which I'm delighted to say has just reopened this week on St. Stephen's Green. You're very welcome to this edition of Generation X, where Professor Barry McCrea will be in conversation with author Belinda McKeon. We're delighted to present this event in partnership with the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Generation X describes the group of people born between 1965 and 1985. So that's a generation caught between baby boomers and millennials, characterized by anti-establishment, slacker culture, cynicism, irony, and after the global economic crash, negative equity. So it's an American term describing American lives. The moniker perhaps fails to accurately represent the experience of those who came of age during the 1980s and 90s in Ireland. So this series invites artists and writers who grew up in an Ireland shaped by the Troubles, social justice movements, EU membership, the peace process, and the Celtic Tiger, of course, to share their work and to reflect on the social and cultural influences at home and abroad. Belinda McKeon is one of my favourite writers, the author of the novels Solace and Tender, which won and were nominated for awards including the Irish Book of the Year 2011 and the Encore Prize 2016. Belinda's short fiction has been published in several anthologies and journals, most recently Granta and Being Various Faber New Irish Stories. She's Associate Professor of Creative Writing at Rutgers University, where she has taught fiction since 2015, and she has an MFA from Columbia University and lives in upstate New York. Barry McCrea is the author of 3 books, a novel, The First Verse, winner of the Farrell Grumley Prize for Fiction, and then 2 academic works, most recently Languages of the Night, which won the Wellick Prize for Best Book of 2016. He's Donald R. Keough Family Professor of Irish Studies and Professor of Irish Language and Literature and Romance Languages and Literatures at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches modern European literature on its campuses in Indiana, Rome, and Dublin. Before I go, I'd just like to remind you that becoming a MoLI member or giving membership to a friend is the best way to support the museum and its programming. So to find out more about that, visit moli.ie/membership. Wherever you're watching in the world, I really hope you enjoy the event. We're delighted to be co-hosting with the Keough-Naughton Institute, and I will pass you over now to Belinda McKeon and Professor Barry McCrea. Thank you.
You're all very welcome to our first meeting in this series about Irish Generation X writers. And our guest this evening, or this afternoon, for those of you in the US, is Belinda McKeon. Before I start talking to Belinda, I would just like to thank 2 people in particular on the Notre Dame side. We're delighted to have this collaboration with the Museum of Literature Ireland, and we're very grateful to them. But on the Notre Dame side, I'd like to thank Catherine Wilsden, who co-conceived this series with me, and our colleague Mary Hendrickson over in South Bend. Without them, this wouldn't have happened. So our first guest is Belinda McKeon, a novelist, well, a writer, in fact, who is now living in the US, but is originally from Ireland. She's the author of 2 prize-winning novels, Solace and Tender. So you're very welcome, Belinda. Thanks for making
Thanks, Barry.
time.
Thank you.
I thought I might start by asking you about the title, the term Generation X. As you know, in the US, it's very much in vogue now to think of the country in various demographic categories, according to various demographic categories, one of which is generation. And it's usually described as a conflict between the baby boomers, those born just after the war, and the millennials, those born after the mid-80s. But in between, there is the sandwich generation, Generation X, who in the American imagination are characterized by a series of, a series of different traits. And I suppose my first question to you is, to what extent do you think there is an Irish Generation X, that the writers born, let's say, or people born in the long 1970s, between the late 60s and the mid 80s, to what extent they are a definable generation, and to what extent it makes sense to talk of them using the American term?
Hi, thanks for having me, and hi to everybody who's attending. So I read a piece by the writer Darragh O'Shea. He wrote a book called Mother Folklore, where he talked about the idea of generations as astrology for sociologists, which I thought was really good, because there is something silly about it, about the categories. And particularly when you try to, I think that Generation X works in an American context because it was invented in an American context, really, indeed, as was the notion of a teenager. It doesn't translate in any straightforward way to Ireland. The UK is another matter, but Ireland, the generation born between 1965 and 1980, for one thing, as writers, didn't really start producing work until the mid to late 90s. So there isn't a way to compare, the work of, where's the David Foster Wallace of Ireland? Well, they weren't writing at the same time as David Foster Wallace. Where's the Bret Easton Ellis? They weren't writing at the same time as Bret Easton Ellis, if they exist. Maybe they don't. Their work would have been published much later. So there's a lag in that sense. But there's also a way in which Generation X had a sort of a different fight, in America, or a different identity, obviously, in America than in Ireland. I mean, the generation born in the 1970s in Ireland weren't like the generation born in the 1970s in the US. The generation born in Ireland were still dealing with so many of the hangovers of the equivalent of the baby boomers. You talked there about them as the sandwich generation in the US, reacting to the baby boomers and revolting against the baby boomers, who were in turn revolting against the silent generation, the generation who went to war, to World War II. But our reactions and our rebellions in Ireland were of a totally different nature, and they've caused this sort of layering, I think, where in some ways, if you use novelists as an example, you could say that Anne Enright's early books were Generation X books, right? But she was born in the 50s, right? No, sorry, Anne. She was born in the early 60s, so she's just about to be in the Generation X category. But then you could also say of some of the novels produced in the last 10 years that they show some of the characteristics of Generation X, the irony, the malaise, the dark wryness. So I think it's not really possible to just take it and slot it wholesale onto the Irish experience.
Nonetheless, do you think that there are experiences that our generation had, those of us born in the 1970s, that do make us distinct from the generation before us or the generation coming after us, whether as writers or just as people?
I mean, yeah, of course. But it's, to generalize, I mean, I think for many of us, the fact that our education was free, third level education was accessible in a way it hadn't been previously, was obviously a massive thing. But then, along with that access and with the openness to the world, and the European open, like the fact that we're becoming part of a European project at that time, along with that was the continuing sort of crushing influence of the Catholic Church. Yeah. I was born in Longford in 1979, and 5 years later in Longford, the death of Anne Lovett happened. We're still in many ways discovering the extent and depth of the abuse carried out by priests, sexual abuses and the abuses that happened in institutions, and that was still happening during that time. And then the other thing that I really feel you have to say is that in Ireland, the X case was what defined Generation X. Our X was of a totally different nature. So I suppose it's that combination of moving forward and yet still being stuck in the sludge that the equivalent of the silent generation were stuck in, not just the baby boomers, but the generation 2 generations ago.
I suppose you mentioned the 90s there as being the key decade when I suppose Generation X, if we call them that in Ireland, started to publish and express their voices culturally. And if you think about it, we entered the 1990s, a poor country with high unemployment, an almost entirely white country, where divorce was illegal, homosexuality was illegal. And we left the 90s and none of those things were the case. I wonder if you might say something about your own experience of the 90s from that point of view, in terms of, I suppose, feminism, or any of these other social issues that your work touches on.
Well, I was in secondary school in a convent for the first part of the 90s, and I was at college at Trinity for the second part of the 90s. So there were two starkly different experiences. And in a way, for me, that was me moving from the baby boomer or silent generation land into something like Generation X, into something like the 90s of which I had heard tell. And they were only a rumor when I was living in Longford as a teenager. But by the time I was in Dublin and meeting people from diverse backgrounds, and in a college where women campaigned for access to abortion, and where women, would write phone numbers on the backs of doors, it was a different country, in several ways. Sorry if you can hear my baby and screaming in the background. It's his nap time. So my experience, was of a sort of like a generational shift, which was the rural-urban divide as well. Maybe, moving from the country to the city, and moving from particularly a small farm, to living with friends in Dublin, and living a very free life, having intellectual access that I hadn't had before, by which I mean a library and essays to write, and a university education. It was a big life-changing event for me, but I feel I'm going off the point a little bit now, so maybe pull me back in and remind me what you were asking me.
No, you're on the point completely. I thought maybe we would talk about then the first part of that divide, the convent school part, if you like, the way you set it up there, because your work deals a lot and very sensitively with these two poles, let's call it the countryside and Dublin, and then later on with the third pole, which is the US, in the end of tender. But let's start with the first part of that, and maybe say something about, when you look back at the cultural landscape of your childhood, what you feel when you think of the cultural soup that we're all cooked in. What looked to you like the defining features of it now, when you look back, the things that most shaped the writing?
So when that film is often spoken of as a defining film of Generation X, came out, Reality Bites, I was 15, I think, 14 or 15, and I couldn't go to see it in the cinema because it didn't come to the cinema in Longford. But I remember reading a lot about it in the magazines that I got, and seeing the clothes that Winona Ryder was wearing in the film, and just finding this like an intoxicating, incredible looking thing, and the storyline, about these young people who lived in a flat basically, and just did whatever the hell they wanted. It was so attractive to me, and it could not have been more different to the life that I was living. I was the eldest of a farming family. I laugh when there's a sort of, it's often one of the things that's often said about Generation X is that they, it's the latchkey generation in America, right? They, because of divorce and because of other factors, they were often the generation who came home from school and were there by themselves and kind of left to their own devices. And so they were creative for that reason, or they had, they knew how to do it boredom. I mean, I think in Ireland, if you were bored, you got landed with a job. If you were in rural Ireland and you were bored, you got sent to the bog, or you had to go out on the farm. There was no and if you behaved like the kind of disaffected teenager that Winona Ryder's character is, or disaffected 19 or 20-year-old, you might not actually get a slap, but you get a metaphorical slap. There just wasn't, we didn't have that register. So that was my experience. Was still, I think I was still living in the Ireland to a certain extent of, even though we just had elected a female president in Ireland, even though, Ireland had gone to the World Cup, or whatever the markers of modernity you might want to use were, we didn't have a very different life to, probably a decade, people growing up a decade or two earlier. It was school was the place where you got to see other people, other ideas, to have space for oneself. I think that if there had been a film or a book that had represented my experience then as a teenager, I would have just eaten it up. If there had been an Irish TV show, the equivalent of My So-Called Life, say, or an Irish novel, the equivalent of, I don't know what the equivalent of maybe like Claire Massoud's later novel, The Emperor's Children. I just would have eaten that up, but they didn't exist. The TV shows that we were watching were American or Australian, and the American ones were very much about Generation X. The Australian ones were about the beach.
Tender begins with a quotation from a poem that we all read for the Leaving Cert, Dreams Fled Away, by Thomas Kinsella. What about the literary influences of your the younger part of your life? McGahern, I know, was a big figure for you too.
It's funny because in a way, when I read Amongst Women, even though it was set in the 50s, I ate that up because I recognized in what the girls were living with, the daughters of that house, not the intensely abusive aspect of it, but just the silent, certain aspects of that rural existence, in a strictly and more conservative family, with not very many outlets. I felt like I was reading about my own adolescence or my own experience. So that was why McGahern became really important to me. And, it's a sort of, it was an infatuation for me, his work, for a long time. And I think because it spoke to me so, because I read that novel Amongst Women when I was 14, I think I was given it as a birthday present from a neighbor, and it sort of blew the doors off the shed for me, but I do think that for people growing up, our generation growing up in Ireland and starting to write, say in the early 90s or whenever it was that you started to write, I think the influences were largely of the McGahern ilk. If you were looking in a domestic sense, if you look at the novels that were published in the 80s, for instance, there aren't any. I mean, there's no McGahern in the 80s, but there's a lot of William Trevor. Banville had a novel every couple of years. Edna O'Brien had novels every couple of years. Edna's work is not at all of the silent generation ilk, but there wasn't really a novelist of doing something different, like doing something radically different, until Anne Haverty, actually, with One Day as a Tiger in the early, I can't remember the year, but it was, I think, the late 80s or early 90s. And then maybe Jamie O'Neill's At Swim Two Boys. It took a very long time, as far as I can see, for that kind of work to push through. And I just wonder why that was, because it's either that people weren't writing, people who were, like, say, 25 in 1990 weren't writing, or they weren't getting published because their work, if it was in any way ironic or postmodern or disaffected or any of those Generation X qualities were attached to it, it just didn't speak to what publishers wanted from Irish writers at the time. And I think that's another reason why, subconscious or unconsciously or intuitively, I started to write in the tradition or in the form of what I knew to be considered powerful Irish writing, the McGahern, etc. And it took me until well after my first novel was published to start to realize that there was a big amount of mimesis there, and I needed to kind of dig myself out from underneath it.
And I suppose, as you're saying, a lot of what McGahern and, in a way, Edna O'Brien were doing, these struggles against the Catholic Church and certain kinds of social mores, were very current for us.
Right. Well, I mean, Amongst Women, published in 1990, the first line is, "As he weakened more and grew afraid of his daughters." I mean, it's like a portrait of one generation. It is a portrait of one generation giving way to another. His daughters, and that's the thing about Generation X in Ireland. His daughters are not Generation X in terms of when they were born. The girls in that novel were born in the late 1940s, probably. But by the end of the novel, it is as though he's portraying teenagers in the 80s or 90s. They behave as adults burying their father the way that teenagers behaved in American novels. They have acquired that kind of freedom of thought. I mean, Sheila, one of the girls, refuses to bring her daughters to the house because she wants them to grow up with the confidence that she didn't have. So McGahern's actually quite explicit about the generational differences. And of course, as a stylist, he was inventive, he took risks, and he didn't give a fuck in so many ways. So of course he spoke to our generation. But I do think that, it's complicated, but I think that there's a way in which his work now has been put aside for a while because writers are want to look to other influences or maybe to a different idea of identity, Irish identity, whatever that is. And that's one thing that he would always have considered childish, talking about identity at all, talking about generations at all.
So what about Trinity then? Because when we chatted to prepare for this a bit, you noticed when you saw the lineup that there's a lot of Trinity. And there was obviously a key moment for you. You write about it a lot as a kind of pivot between one phase of life and another. But what about your experience in Trinity in the 90s and how it shaped you, or what was going on there that influenced you as a writer?
Well, I took a workshop I took a couple of workshops. So I took a workshop with you, Barry. You were one of the other participants in the first year that I was there, 97, with Deirdre Madden, and Paul Murray was in that class, and Lainey Quillinan and Susan Lanigan. And so, a number of us have gone on to publish from that workshop. But I think that also ties into my earlier point, like who got access, who was published at these times. One of the great things about now, when so many books are being published, is that the sense that there isn't such a sort of list of boxes that you have to tick in order to be published. And I do think like a Trinity education or a Trinity connection was one of those, for better or for worse. But for me, Trinity was like, I've written about it a lot because it just kind of, it opened a lot up for me. I just learned in lots of different ways. I learned how to speak differently, in some senses, in a narrow, cringe-inducing way. I got like a Trinity accent. But in others, finally what is often sort of spoken of in terms of Generation X, irony, satire, parody, those things kind of came into so many of the people that I met spoke in those modes. And it's interesting, like just jumping back a bit to childhood, when I started to write, and one of my great comforts was as a kid and as a teenager was parody and satire on TV and radio. We all grew up, I think, no, I won't generalize, but so many of us of that generation grew up listening to Scrap Saturday. I remember the joy of, and only a certain chunk of our generation will get this, but children's TV like Padjo's Junk Box and another show called Scratch Saturday, which was a kind of a version of Scrap Saturday. These were brilliant because they were run by theatre people in Ireland who didn't have any work maybe in the theatre or in TV, so they made children's TV, and it was extremely irreverent, and it was layered, and much like The Den a few years later, it was speaking to two different audiences. It was
Jerry Stambridge.
Children. That's right, Jerry Stambridge. And Anne Enright worked in children's TV. She also worked on Nighthawk, so it's interesting to look at the way that satire and irony, were foundational to the beginning of her career as well. I think that I just found so much. I don't know, it was such a relief to see and watch things that were so deeply funny and irreverent, and maybe just that was a kind of a way out of the rest of the landscape, and even in my family, our way of talking to each other, are the siblings and my mother, it's a kind of, there's a huge amount of reference and parody woven into the way that we talk, So I think that when I went to Trinity, that just became, I think that, first of all, I was bewildered by the extent to which people seem to talk in a language that was created, that was woven almost entirely of irony. And then I started to enjoy it. And there were other things as well. I mean, the usual stuff. But for me, it was just a massive opening up of horizons.
I think you're so right about the satire and irony. And when I look through the list of people that I'll be talking to in this, it's one thing that really makes their work stand apart from either the generation before or after them. And the way you describe it there, a language that was woven entirely out of irony, that is what it felt like. And I wonder, does that happen from being in this ambiguous position? We were neither fully.
Well, that's what they talk. They like when Generation X is written about and theorized about. Irony is always a really big part of that conversation, because I suppose the theory is that it's a rebellion against the certainties that the previous generation believed in, or the respect that a previous generation, the baby boomers, had for the corporate world or authority, for the idea of the American dream in America. And instead, with Generation X, you get kids who are like ironically talking in tropes, in mimicking advertisements, saying things that they mean but they don't mean. So saying that something, that something is cool when they mean the opposite. That's a way of occupying two different realms at once, two different registers at once. Like if something is working as satire or parody, you have to understand the thing it's satirizing and the thing it's a parody of at the same time as you understand and enjoy the parody. And I think maybe that's very true also of Ireland's version of Generation X. I mean, because we still had this foot in, the Ireland of the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, and yet we had the other foot in the 90s, so you're kind of speaking in two different languages at once. And for me, the urban-rural divide was another prong of that.
Well, so I think there were so many of us, unlike the American Generation X, which is a small generation. When we were growing up, there were children everywhere you looked, hanging out of every corner.
Right. Because we weren't small. The Generation X in America was a small generation because the parents had the pill. We didn't have that.
Right. Yeah.
So there were loads of us. Yeah.
Right. Will you read something from for us now?
I'm going to read a short piece from Tender that I haven't read before, as part of the public reading circuit. But I'm reading this part in response to what you asked me earlier about influences and about how the certain ideas of the literary tradition, the canon, or what constitutes Irish writing, were so influential for me. I mean, I won't generalize, because there are lots of people in my generation who are writers who were immediately innovative and inventive and had the confidence to kind of shake off older generations. And I have the writer here that I'm referring to is also very, Pat McCabe. His work kind of blew up certain ideas of what Irish fiction was. But he was, by the time I was writing, an established, respected, male, towering figure in the tradition. And so this is a very short piece where the protagonist, or the central character in Tender, Catherine, who's openly based on me, it's a scene in the college newspaper office, where she's writing for the literary pages of Trinity News, the college newspaper, and she's just getting ready she's doing her work, which is basically, because she's writing about new books, basically involves interviewing older male writers. She wrote the McCabe interview up quickly once she got a desk in the crowded publications office, chopping it off a couple hundred words. Reluctantly, when it was finished, all the good quotes he had given her were long ones, and she wished she could fit them in. But with them in, there was no space for anything about the actual novel, and she printed it out. Seeing it emerge on the tray, Emmett Doyle crossed the room to pick it up for her, looking at the first page as he brought it to her desk. Patrick McCabe strides into the bright surroundings of Café Irie in Temple Bar, looking like a man who is at once distracted and intense. He read aloud. What is this? A novel? Give me that, she said, snatching it from him. He was grinning at her, and for a moment she could almost see what James had meant. He was kind of attractive, his skin clear, his eyes a dark, striking blue, his lanky frame perched now on the edge of her desk. But it was so conventional, his attractiveness. It was not the kind of thing she had imagined whispering over with James. There's a letter for you, by the way, poetess, he said, nodding towards the mailbox on the opposite wall. Did you get it? No, Catherine said, getting up. How long has it been? A couple of days, Emmett shrugged. It's probably Pat McCabe's wife, warning you to stop stalking him. Fuck off, she laughed, taking down the envelope. It was handwritten and bearing a Dublin postmark. She tore it open to find a curt note from the publicist of the novelist Michael Doonan, granting her the interview with him that she had been chasing for months. She was, the publicist explained, to be given 40 minutes on a Friday afternoon the following month, and the questions were to focus on Doonan's new novel, Engines of Everything, not on the earlier trilogy, which had been recently made into a controversial television series. This gave her a few weeks for preparation, which is just as well, because she had only read one of Doonan's books, and she wanted to do a good job on the interview because he so rarely granted them. Restraining order, Emmett said, coming up to her at the mailbox. He was grinning as widely as ever, but the blush was back again. She watched its progress across the smooth skin of his face. Very funny, she said, stuffing the envelope into her pocket. Well, enjoy production night. I have dinner waiting for me. He gave her a disbelieving look. What, has your mother moved in with you or something? No, she said, laughing. Just my friend, James. Oh, James, is it? That's the ginger. I saw you hugging outside the arts block this morning. I was heartbroken, Riley. I thought the time we spent together on Saturday night meant something. You came back to my place with about 100 other people. And then this morning, I'm coming out of my politics lecture. You were not coming out of a politics tutorial at 11:30 in the morning. To see you, I resent that, by the way. To see you with your arms around another man, I'm heartbroken, Riley. Devastated. This was Doyle's usual routine, this layering of sarcasm onto mockery, onto brazen cheek, onto what deep down might even be a trace of genuine honesty, until it was impossible to tell which was which and what was what. It was a code, deep irony by means of the presence of sincerity, in which he and a few of the other TN guys frequently spoke, and Catherine could not get her head around it. Talking to them, she tried to imitate it, but her efforts always seemed to come out just sounding bitchy. Fuck off, Doyle, she said now, and exactly that thing happened, but Emmett seemed not to notice. You brought your friend to my party the other night, right? I was talking to him for a while. Yeah, he just got back from Berlin. Very strong culty accent for a German. Hilarious, she said, as she gathered the things from the desk, her notes, her jacket, her bag. Right, I'm off home, she said, making for the door. Okay, I'll leave it there.
So we'll get to, there's a lot of questions coming in on the chat now, but I'd just like to say one quick thing in response to that reading, which is that, you know, I feel many of the ways in which you talk about or describe gender in that novel are, I suppose prescient isn't exactly the word, but they were ideas that people took up later than you and became more central to the way we think about those things. And it's one of the things about Tender is that in many ways it's ahead of its time in describing.
Maybe I should have called it gender.
Well, I don't. Maybe there's time for a sequel. No, but let's get to some of the questions because they're in the chat. So this is a question from Laura. Do you think there's a huge difference in terms of the Gen X experience and the experience of millennials, people born from the mid-80s to the mid-90s, that may be connected to what we were just talking about?
Yeah, but just because of the experience that they had in terms of the internet, because, you know, for people of our generation, Barry, the internet was one computer in college that you got to sit on for half an hour in the morning, you know. But by the time somebody even 7 or 8 years younger was growing up, it was a constant, you know, it was the air around your head, and now it's obviously so ever present that it's not even worth talking about. But I think that made a big difference. How I don't know, but I mean, if you look at the difference between the numbers of people from the 70s, born in the 70s, say, you know, who published novels, and the numbers of people born in the late 80s and 90s who are publishing early, it is significant. You know, there is a sort of I think there's a confidence, and it's a good thing. There's access. There's a different kind of thankfully a different notion of who should publish a novel and who shouldn't. The gatekeepers are different. They're not really. The gatekeepers don't have as much power anymore. They're really pissed off about it. It's great.
I suppose there's more gates to keep as well. I mean, as in this, if one is shut, there's other ones too.
Yeah.
What about gender in that sense? Because in Tender, we have, it happens in two different, I mean, gender in the broadest sense. We have Catherine, who is making her way as a talented but sometimes uncertain woman in this world of Trinity. And then we have her friend James, who's gay. And it's just 1997, my last year in college. When I started college, there was almost no person I knew of who was an out gay person in Trinity. It was almost unheard of. So you capture, I think, Trinity at this, Ireland, but in the microcosm of Trinity campus at this moment when things were really shifting and quite rapidly.
Oh, well, I had much the same experience, Barry. I was a few years behind you, but people didn't come out. It was so difficult. And that was the first generation. After decriminalization, right? Like decriminalization was in 1993. So if you were in college in 1997, then you were the first person to turn 18 who didn't risk, in theory, being arrested if you snogged your boyfriend and you were also a boy, or, a girl and also a girl. If there was evidence that you slept with them, because of course the crime was about the sexual act. It was just part of what because it was, I don't really know what to say to that. In some senses, I don't think it was very different by the time we left, by the way. Like I left in 2000. It was still pretty unusual for someone to come out.
And what about Catherine herself and her uncertainties and those kinds of interactions in the publications office? I suppose this is an old question. Do things get better, or does the patriarchy just linger like a bad smell that can never be got rid of?
When I was in college, I was so in awe of women, like in my time, like Anya O'Keefe and Avril Keating, who were the student union women's rights officers or women's officers, and they used to, the women who were at the front of because the protests were happening. The protests against the referenda that were happening around abortion and divorce were recent. There were several, reasons for women to be out on the streets. And I didn't consider myself a part of that. It's not something I'm proud of, but I felt uninformed, and I just didn't have the guts to be like, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be the women's rights officer in the student union. The amount of shit you'd have to deal with, first of all, but also just knowing how to do that and what was needed. So in a way, I spent, I succeeded by kind of keeping my head down and pandering a little. And again, that's part of what I'm talking about when I say that I kind of, after like way into my early 30s, before I kind of looked up and thought, I've kind of pretended a lot not to be a woman writing.
So this connects very well to a question that is from Simon. The transitional period you map out in Tender feels like primarily a moral exploration rather than a nostalgic one. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. But it's not really for me to say, but I do agree that there's a moral arc to the novel, which begins, and it's about, and ironically, it's about respect for another person's privacy. And so at the beginning of the novel, there's the situation that Catherine is in with her parents and with the local neighbor who spies on her, and she can't, nothing is allowed. And obviously James, as a closeted young gay man, nothing is allowed. And by the end, the final scene, which is set in a gallery, Catherine is walking around looking at images of James's lovers, so he's free to say, these are the men that I've loved. But of course, there's the irony as well that he's using their images. He's free to say, these are my lovers, but they may not be free to say, well, I don't particularly want to be in a photograph on a gallery wall in Chelsea, thank you. So the moral arc, or the moral journey there, is from everyone's business. Your business is everyone's business, to your business is your own. And I think that's, that is the change from the baby boomers to the millennials. And we're in the middle of that.
Somebody called Catherine is asking, at the beginning of Tender, Catherine is unsettled by James' openness and honesty. Do you think Catherine's reaction is a hallmark of older generations of Irish people? Could millennials relate?
I don't know if millennials, well, I did when the novel came out, I did get a lot of letters from, or even DMs, I should say, not letters, from younger people. Yes, it is. That's the way she's learned to think. We learn to think in the language and in the thought rhythms of the people who teach us. And she has inherited those modes of reacting and thinking, and it'll take her work to step out of them and replace them with something else.
So here's a very specific question, Belinda, from Murish. About Germany, and I'm interested in it because my memory of college too is that a lot of people went to work in Germany in the summers and came back. But also in general, that a lot of people went to Europe for the summers. I did modern languages, so I suppose a lot of it, but then who came back, and they brought a lot back with them, the seeds of a sexual revolution in ways. So Murish's question is, Berlin figures as this imagined place as part of the Irish diaspora. I suppose he's talking about he has a culture accent for a German. That must be where this was.
Right. So James goes to Berlin for a year to work as an apprentice to a photographer there.
So Berlin figures as this imagined place, but is often overshadowed by places like Britain and the US. What role does Germany and Berlin play in the diasporic imagination of the Gen X Irish? I think about Jockster Goes to Stuttgart by Christy Moore as one cultural reference.
Right, and is it the Generation X Berlin? Like, is it the Berlin when the wall fell? Because that is that's Berlin of of Generation X, or is it Berlin now? Where we're at least one Gen X novelist I can think of is living. What role does it play? I think that it's still a utopia of some sort of intellectual freedom and of privacy, and I've also it's affordable apparently. I don't know whether that's still the case, but it's a place where people can live and produce work. Work, not even produce work. That's a neoliberal way of thinking about art. A place where people can practice their art and not have to pay rent that is impossible to pay without also working. So I don't know much about Berlin, as is probably obvious from my answer, but my sense of it is that it's a place that many artists would like Ireland to be more like.
And it does play an important structural role in Tender, as
it does, but it's the Berlin of the late 90s, and James, the character in Tender, goes to Berlin to work as an apprentice photographer with a famous photographer, and but he doesn't really have a great time there. It's not like his repression follows him. He doesn't manage to get over it. Berlin isn't his awakening. And, that in a way was kind of a symptom of just how much of a number Ireland did on that generation. That it's not just as simple as going in your Erasmus year and coming back without your virginity. Didn't work like that for everybody.
Yeah, leave it behind. Yeah. So Joseph has just anticipated my next question, indeed, which is, he says, is living in the US affecting your creativity? The way I would have phrased the question myself was, what did America, you left, after college, you stayed in Ireland for quite a few years, working with the Irish Times and studying philosophy, and then you lit out to New York and you're still there. So what has America meant to you? Has that changed? And indeed, as Joseph says, has it shaped your life and mind as a writer?
Well, I mean, I wrote my 2 novels when I was living here. So it didn't in any way stump my creativity, but I do find that I miss almost to the point of thinking that I have to, like, I don't think I don't really see myself here long term, partly because I really miss the texture of what it sounds like to live in Ireland, listening to people's voices and listening to ways of speech. I really miss that, and I not even just in a conscious way. I think that is affecting my my ability to write to some extent. But in other ways, I mean, America has been such a gift. I mean, when I came here, I was introduced I was taking a course at the time, and I was introduced to writers I'd never heard of, and basically my reading list opened up beyond the writers that I was faithfully reading, the McGarrans and Joyces and Trevors, and even Anne Enright and Ed O'Brien. I mean, the great presences. But I started reading Deborah Eisenberg, who's been really important to me, Antonia Nelson, George Saunders. I mean, I don't have my list ready, but there's a lot of them, and a lot of them are short story writers, actually. I think the American tradition of the short story is so different to the Irish one, and it has so much more kind of muscular. Well, maybe that's no longer the case, but it has a. It's more of a Generation X form, actually, than it was in Ireland, where for so long it was under the Joycean boot, Although you could say that Dubliners is a Generation X book, way ahead of its time.
I think so, very much. Yeah, very much. And I mean, especially it's a kind of early 90s Generation X book in the sense of also people kind of not wandering around with nothing to do seems like not quite the way to put it, but I think you know what I mean. But I suppose, and this is a question they always ask, just, there's the being separated from Irish ways of speech and all that, but is there an artistic freedom in being away from Ireland also?
Yeah, massively. Nobody gives a fuck. Nobody knows I mean, not that anybody knows who I am at home, but you know what I mean? It's such a small country. Wherever you live is going to be such a small town. There is immense freedom here in just getting lost in the crowd. And I think I've done that in an even more conscious way. We moved out of the city. We moved to a small city upstate. Nobody really even knows I'm a writer here. So there's absolutely no expectation, and that's a bad thing and a good thing at the same time. I always get much more nervous doing Irish events than I do doing American events, and I know this kind of straddles the two, but there's a deep self-consciousness that the Irish version of me as a writer is hit by that the version of me in America doesn't really have. But sadly, I'm Irish to the bone, so the self-consciousness wins. I was talking about this with my class. I teach. I'm teaching a Zoom class for the Irish Writers Centre at the moment, and we were talking about self-consciousness and the idea of there's a letter that Elizabeth Bishop wrote to Anne Stevenson where she talked about self-forgetfulness being the aim. To create art, you want to achieve a certain type of self-forgetfulness, a kind of useless concentration. And we were talking about how in the Irish scene and the Irish literary scene, such as it is, it's so difficult to achieve that because there's always chatter in your head. And, I'm talking about missing the sound of Irish voice and the turns of phrase. And obviously the flip side of that is those voices, the kind of the chatter and the notion that everyone in the village has something to say.
And do you find the US has changed in ways that the culture of literary?
It's hopefully changed a lot in the last. Well, I mean, I don't know how to even begin answering the question, Barry. I think that here's what I think. I think we have now a few years of possible respite, and in 2024, it's going to be worse than it was in 2016. That's what I think is going to happen. I think that the morning after the election, even though I still believed that Biden was going to win, to see the sheer number of votes that man received, that's not good. Things are very, very damaged here.
What about the literary and cultural landscape? You teach at Rutgers, so you're connected to the university world.
I mean, it's there's so much terrific work being done. Like, there's so many brilliant writers. Yeah, that's great, but it's not much. To be a brilliant writer, Jessamine Ward, the novelist, wrote an amazing piece for, I think, The Atlantic, about her husband died of COVID in March. There's a terrific generation of writers, and they will be beset by exactly the same problems and injustices and inequalities as the non-writers, citizens of America. Yes, there's going to be some powerful short stories and novels about this experience. I mean, in a very Generation X way. So what? If the underlying conditions are not going to be changed.
I suppose I was more curious to know if you think if you've seen a change in any way, if you think the literary culture in the US has shifted or grown or altered in the time you've been there.
Just in terms of diversity, which is really noticeable. I came here in 2005, and you open the review pages or look around the classroom, and most of the faces were white, and that's changed. There's obviously far more awareness of how many people are writing and how many people have been for too long sort of left out of the room. There's that's the main thing, I guess. And I don't have, in terms of, we're talking about stylistic changes or stylistic patterns or trends. No, I don't think, I don't even think I have enough distance on 15 years here to talk about that. That'll become apparent maybe in 20 years if we're still here.
And what about what you see of Ireland from your perch over there? I'm sure it happens to you as well. People often talk about it now with great admiration as a place where the political life is healthier, where social mores are becoming more liberal and more open. That's what Americans say often. And what's your sense of looking at Ireland from over there and how it's going?
Pretty good. I keep in touch with it largely through social media and podcasts, actually. And, I listen to something like Una Mullally and her co-host, I can't remember her co-host's name, damn it. They have a podcast called United Ireland, which is not about the wish for United Ireland, but about Ireland in a large way. And I just really admire the intelligence and kind of forthrightness and irreverence, and there's just a really continuing frankness and yes, irony about the way that Irish people talk about their own country and what's happening there. I think it's doing fine.
Good, limelight last. Well, thank you very much. We're going to start winding up now. That flew. We're really very grateful you made this time for us. It was great to hear from you, and we're all looking forward to whatever you write next. I'm not going to ask because I always think people need to keep that to themselves.
Yeah.
But we're all looking forward to it. For those of us who've joined us, our next guest is the writer Paul Murray, and that will be at the same time on the 6th of January. So just Nollignaman. we will the Epiphany. I'll be talking to Paul Murray. So thank you, Belinda, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks to everybody and to MoLI. Take care.